Part three, so the cultural aspects. So this is the interesting and fun part, as we were just saying. We're going to go through a few different things, but it was curious. You know, I've been preparing this presentation, I suppose, for the last week, and I have a couple of daughters. My eldest daughter, I was just, you know, she was asking me what I was doing, and I was on this Norwegian culture section, and I was saying, you know, we're going to be explaining to all these different people about Norwegian culture. I was saying, what is Norwegian culture for you? So her take on Norwegian culture was that it consists of vafler, brunost, and brus. So vafler are waffles. Okay, that's fair enough. They're everywhere. Brunost is a kind of a caramelized flavor cheese. Very, very strange. Kind of hard to tell if you like it or hate it, but it's really, really good at times. And then brus is this ubiquitous drink that the kids drink all year, this kind of flavored non-fizzy drink. So that was a child's take on Norwegian culture. So interestingly, I think there's a lot of curious things about Norway that I certainly wasn't aware of when we moved up here. And we're going to deal with all of these issues. So, you know, cultural differences and interpreting how to deal with different cultures is a key aspect of any business venture in a foreign country. Obviously, those differences will inform the social norms and the habits. We have this concept of the janteloven, the kind of the unwritten rules of behavior with Norwegians. And obviously, the culture informs the business culture and the business practices. We're going to look a little bit at the cultural dimensions, and you know, from the country analysis table of contents, you had listed a number of these dimensions from the Hofstede's 6D model. We're going to deal extensively with meetings, how it affects meetings, how it affects communication, how it affects negotiation, and then some of the basic stuff as well that was in the request relating to eating, to gifts, and to travel. Okay, so social norms and habits. I'm going to tell you a few different stories that I think will help illustrate, maybe better than just the theory and, you know, and just telling you what Norwegian culture is like. I think the stories are going to help to illustrate that. And what I would like as well is if any of you have had interactions with Norwegians that weren't as you expected, or that you felt that there were kind of strange behavior on the part of your Norwegian interlocutor, I would be very interested if you can include those in the chat box, or just mention it in the chat box, and maybe then Petra can tell me, and we can listen to those. Okay, so the first one we're going to look at is about blame and the curious case of the Helge Ingestad. So what you're looking at there is the sorry picture of the Helge Ingestad from 2019, I believe. So this is a frigate belonging to the Norwegian Navy, and they purchased it from Navantia in Spain, actually, in 2010. So it was a relatively young frigate. And in 2019, when returning at nighttime from some NATO exercises off the west coast of Norway, it crashed into an oil tanker that was coming out, actually just about 5 kilometers from where I am here, that was coming out of a refinery about 5 kilometers from where I stand. And the accident investigation into this was astonishing. So there were a catalogue of mistakes and failures and negligence and incompetence and human error. And they didn't have enough people on the bridge. They didn't have the right level of training for the people who were on the bridge navigating at that point in time. They had switched off the radar that was going to help them navigate into this particular fjord. They didn't have the right experience amongst the crew members, and basically they mistook the lights on this giant tanker that were coming out of the bay. They mistook those lights for the actual installation that the tanker had left. So they were trying to stay on the right of those lights because they assumed that was the coastline. But in fact, the tanker had pulled out and was trying to stay on the left of the frigate. By the time they realized it was too late, they collided with the front of the tanker, and the anchor, the giant anchor on the front of the tanker, basically opened the side of the frigate like a tin can. Okay, so that's bad enough. So the frigate knows, okay, we're in trouble here. They lost power, and they gave the instruction to evacuate the frigate. And during the evacuation procedure, they forgot to seal the hatches, right? And by just forgetting to seal the hatches, that would have made the difference between the boat sinking and being a total write-off, and the boat could have been salvaged and repaired. So the estimate for the repair job, if they had closed the hatches, was 7 million euros. Instead, they lost a €500 million frigate. Okay, so the question is, and the boat wasn't insured. Okay, but that was just a by the way. The question is, how many people do you think got fired because of this? So I don't know if anybody wants to just write up in the chat, how many people do you think would get fired due to an incident of this nature? Okay, I see a couple of you on at the start, and actually those who said none are all correct. So nobody was fired. This was the Norwegian way. A mistake was made, evidently a catastrophic mistake, but it was still just a mistake. Nobody died, which was a key thing. I think if people had died, it would have been different. But it being Norway, they decided, okay, the most important thing here is that we learn from our mistakes. We get to the bottom of this. So they went through a process. Like there were some court cases against the tanker owners and operators. They were exonerated. There was a court case with the Spanish builder of the boat. They were exonerated. And it was purely down to incompetence, lack of training, lack of the right skill set, lack of correct procedures. And so they said, we'll learn from the mistakes and we'll create new protocols. And basically that was it. There was no public outcry. There was nobody looking for the head of somebody. It was just a Norwegian solution. And the last, I read through the accident report and the investigation afterwards. And the last comments that were made were that, and we have even learned from the scrapping process, and we've documented. So now we're actually going to know how to scrap the other boats of this type when it comes to their end of life. And that was basically considered a successful conclusion to this disaster. Okay, so in terms of blame, I think one of the things is that there's a really strong tolerance to mistakes and learning as you go, as long as you learn from the mistake, as long as you don't do the same thing with the next frigate and the oil tanker again. Okay, so in terms of Norwegian business practices, there is an acceptance of trial and error and failure. You're expected to learn from your mistakes, not repeat them. And if that happens, the mistake is then actually considered very valuable. So in this case, if you're dealing with Norwegians and you make a mistake, the last thing you try and do is hide it or kind of talk it down. You acknowledge it, and you document it, and you share it in the sense, and you I don't like to use the word spin, but you what would I say? You give it a different focus, and you share it as something that everybody in the team can learn from. You discuss it with your team, you adjust your routines or your instructions to close the loop. So that was the curious case of the Helge Ingestad. Okay, the next one I'm going to tell you is about the presumption of trust. So when we started here, we've got 2 kids, and the youngest one, while she had done 3 years of school in Spain, she would be just starting school in Norway. So in Norway, when your kids are in the lower levels of primary school, they have a thing called SFO, SFU. And SFU is basically that the children at the end of their normal day, they stay on for another 2.5 hours. So a different set of monitors, let's say, come in, take over from the teaching staff. Kids all stay in the room. And basically they have their lunch, then they do activities, they do arts and crafts, and they do supervised play. And the kids love it. Practically all the kids go to it. But it's not included in school. It's a separate thing and you got to pay for it. It's subsidized, but you have to pay for it. So when we signed the kids up at school, they explained about this SFU and they said, okay, we just need your daughter's ID number. And we explained, well, because of Corona, the waiting time to visit the UDI office and get the ID number was 3 months. So we can't give you her ID number. But I said, listen, it's no problem. Just send me the invoice. I'll pay it. And, if you can sign her up, then we'll, when she has the ID number, you can complete the paperwork. And they said, no, absolutely not. That, she's here in the school. She has a right to go to the SFU. She can start. Forget about the paperwork. Don't worry about the money. We know you'll pay us. Okay. Now, I'm pretty sure if there was a similar service being offered to me in Ireland or in Spain, and somebody was willing to let me just avail of the service for various months, not having met me ever before, I think they would have accepted my offer to pay. But not in Norway. The absolute presumption is trust. And we've seen that time and time again in everything that we've had to get involved in. If there was anything that involved an element of trust, the presumption is total trust. The presumption is never that, oh, we got to watch out with this guy. He's a foreigner, comes from somewhere else. We don't know his background. So that was a real one of the big things that jumped out at me. The other thing is that another aspect of that, and again, this is going back just personal story. Obviously, where we live in Norway, for the months of November, December, January, February, the kids can be going to school in the dark. And at least in Norway, I'm not sure about Sweden, the kids from the age of about 5 or 6, they go on their own. And that's it. There's no teams of parents helicoptering kids into the school. They just put on their rain gear and they go off. They might go in groups. They might go on their own. They have their high-vis jacket on. It's pitch dark and off they go. And for, I think I mentioned before, my wife is Spanish. I can assure you, for a Spanish mum to be leaving her kid off at, in the pitch dark going to school, a 5-year-old, this is just completely against everything that's in the DNA. But here in Norway, it's just something that is assumed to make sense. There's a presumption of trust. The driving habits are extremely civilized, extremely so. And the children are just assumed to be safe, and that's a good thing for them. And it's a good thing for society that parents don't have to bring them to school. So that's the second story. All right. The next one is, and again, I'd be curious to know, Petra, if this exists in Sweden, but we have what we call the dugnad. So we live in a kind of I suppose, scheme of houses that has some standard houses, as I would call them, and some apartments, and there's a children's play area in the middle, and there's green areas, and there's a large complex. So twice a year, they organize this thing called the dugnad. So when the first one came up, the neighbors explained to us that it was this event where all the neighbors get together one Saturday, and the neighborhood association has a load of tools and hedge clippers and gloves and cleaning apparatus and shovels and spades and wheelbarrows and everything you would need for garden or exterior maintenance, literally everything. And basically everybody turns up. The president of the community association says a few words, people volunteer for jobs, and off you go. And then, at 12 o'clock or maybe 11:30, you stop for for lunch of the famous vafler, and then you continue in the afternoon. The idea is that basically the community all works together in a kind of a loosely organized group, but they're all moving in the right direction and their hearts are all in the right place. Not necessarily do you have, like in this image, you have, I think, one person there power hosing. She might not be the expert on power hosing, but she just volunteered for the job, and that's fine. And at the end of the dugnad, it might not be a great job, but at least it's better than it was when it started. And everybody worked together. And this is the essence of Norwegian culture. Okay. Okay, next one up relates to closeness, I suppose, personal, power distance and that concept. I'm going to show you a picture, and I'm going to ask if anybody knows who this lady is. I'm sure Petra does, so she need not answer. So feel free to put the comments into the into the chat box. Oh, I'm after. Oh, wait a second here. I had turned off my chat box. Okay.
It was a tricky question.
Okay, well, maybe nobody knows who she is. That's the thing. I actually expect that maybe nobody does know who she is, because the food looks lovely. So basically what we see is a lady preparing maybe lunch for some guests. See a bottle of wine there. You've got the ironing table is out. The press, the cupboard is a bit of a mess. The kitchen is a bit of a mess. Basically, it's a normal house, right? And so this is Erna Solberg. So she was the Prime Minister of Norway from 2013 to 2021. I think maybe it would be fair to say, and I'm not in Norway long enough to say this, but while she was the Prime Minister, she struck me as similar kind of character to an Angela Merkel. No fuss, kind of pretty much down to earth, often kind of seen out and about, not at all a glamorous dresser. It was more important the message than the image, I would say. So there was this idea of closeness. So one of the things that the anecdotes from our first year in Norway was that my older daughter was in what they call here a velkomstklasse. So they have this system for kids who come from other countries. This is actually also important for any of your SME members who might send people with their families. So for kids who come from other countries where they don't speak Norwegian, or they don't have Norwegian language from because of their parents or whatever, there's a system called the welcome class that they run in the school systems here. So our elder daughter went into it. Our younger daughter didn't have to because she was starting with the other kids at school. And basically this was a way to help kids who didn't have Norwegian to get up to speed quickly so they could then join the normal school system. So as part of that process, and it was really brilliantly resourced and managed, really, really tremendously well run. And they all had to write a letter to the Prime Minister. So, in Norwegian, obviously. So that was good. And, we thought, fair enough, that's the exercise. And they learn by writing the letter, and they tell her about their experience in Norway and a few different things about where they've come from, et cetera, et cetera. Lo and behold, a month later, a letter comes back. And now, obviously, none of us are naive enough to think that Erna Solberg, as the Prime Minister, was writing letters to children, but somebody was writing letters to children, and she was signing them. And the letters weren't just a kind of a standard letter. It was basically a letter that referenced issues that were mentioned in the letter that the kid wrote. So I was kind of astonished at this, but I think it's all part of the idea that, the Prime Minister, and actually the Prime Minister lives, this Prime Minister lives across the lake from where I am here. She's a Bergen lady. But the people who live in that neighborhood, they see her out and about. So she would take part in the dugnad. She'd be shopping in the Spar. And that's considered totally normal in Norway. So there's no great, obviously there are different classes, but that there's no obvious class differences that are manifested. So richer people or more powerful people or more successful people generally don't seem to want to show off, that difference. And one of the other things that has kind of struck me is that Norway is perhaps the only country I've been to where it seems that to take an example, the bus driver can live next door to the surgeon, and that's fine. Like, the surgeon may have started as a trainee doctor, but when he became a surgeon, he didn't then up sticks and move into the fancy part of town. He stayed living in his house because it didn't matter to him, and his house was probably nice to start with. So, the neighbors that we have in this row of houses, they were all built in 1984. Everybody who bought the house in 1984 stayed here. I've not been in any other country where I think that could actually have happened, maybe with the exception of some of the other Nordic countries. But also, I've never been anywhere where, like, the guy who becomes, or the lady who becomes extremely successful and extremely wealthy stays in the same place, living beside the same neighbors. They will tend to move, basically. So that's Erna. Okay, next up. Okay, survival. So this is really interesting. The Norwegians are very much an outdoor type people. Saturdays, Sundays are for hiking in the hills. They really love this. And there's a huge difference between the social interaction you may have with a Norwegian in a work environment and the social interaction you could have with a Norwegian when you're out and about. So the example I could give is that after a couple of years in Norway, we've been to one house where both the people were Norwegian. Okay, so let's say both the husband and wife, both the partners were Norwegian. We've been invited to many other houses where maybe one of the partners is a foreigner. So it's interesting. It's very unusual to get invited to a Norwegian's house when you're a recent arrival. But if you meet those same Norwegians out on a walk and you're in a little shelter like this, they will share with you and they will chat with you till the cows come home. So it's a really interesting kind of thing that once they're out in nature, they're very much in a different social mode. And there's also, it's probably changing. I see the children that my kids hang out with. I think it's going to change pretty dramatically. But any Norwegians over the age of 50 or 60, they have a very, very strong, I would say, kind of frugal element to their character. So you have to bear in mind that Norway, emigration was a huge element in Norwegian society in the 19th and early 20th century. So I think after Ireland, Norway was the country in Europe that lost the highest percentage of its population to emigration. So there's a huge emphasis here on being self-sufficient and being able to look after yourself, and that carries through in all elements of the Norwegian character, I believe. Okay, the next story, and again, I think this is very illustrative, is in terms of education. So many of you, certainly the Swedes, are very well aware that the Nordic model of education tends to differ a lot from the rest of Europe, and children start at a later age. But it still never ceased to amaze me. Up to the age of 5, the kids are in a kind of a creche, and it's very kind of outdoorsy, kind of climbing in the trees sort of creche. And my youngest daughter, when she started in school here, they just put her into the normal Norwegian class, and they were really paying a lot of attention to her on the early days, because they were concerned that, she's arriving here, she doesn't speak Norwegian, obviously, she's in a strange environment, she could be very upset. But actually, on the first day at school, there were a bunch of kids crying who had come from the Barnehage. But because our daughter had been in school for 3 years, this was like, it was nothing new, it was a big school, and in we go. Whereas the other kids had been climbing in the trees, and then they were off to school. So it was a bit of a shock to I think more of a shock to their system. But the way they bring the children through education is also really, really different to the way it's done in the rest of Europe. And I think it also gives us an insight into the Norwegian character. And so the idea is that the idea is really based around getting the children to work together. It's not at all based around getting as much information into the kids or as much learning into the kids as quickly as possible. So for our kids, to give the contrast with the Spanish educational system, the comment that came back from our children was that Norway is paradise for children. So I think that'll give an indication of the different schooling styles that were in evidence. But I remember one day, and this anecdote I think is interesting. I was speaking with an Egyptian woman, and she had moved to Norway with her husband, who was Japanese, and they were both space scientists. Okay, so they were doing high-level research at the University of Bergen, and she was explaining to our Norwegian teacher, and so it was a Norwegian language class, and she was explaining to the Norwegian teacher that previously she had lived in Germany. And when she lived in Germany, her son was going to the I think maybe an international school or a Japanese school or something like that in Germany, and that she mentioned that that he had learned to multiply at the age of 4, right? So, and that she was complaining that now he was in Norway and he was out climbing trees, and she thought that this was, there's something clearly wrong with the Norwegian educational system. So the teacher, Norwegians generally don't take offense, but the teacher took offense to this. And the comment that she made, I thought was really interesting. She said, yeah, but in Norway, we don't care if the child learns to multiply at 4 or learns to multiply at 14. The important thing is that they learn to multiply and that they're happy and that they're able to get on with other kids. Because when they leave school, there's jobs for everybody. So, so what's the issue about not teaching them to multiply when they're young? And, and that's it. In an economy where there are, in inverted commas, jobs for everybody and plenty of resources, they then have this cushion and this luxury of saying, well, what's the function of education? Well, it can be a different function than it has in other economies where there's probably huge competition for jobs, like Spain, and I'm sure like Italy, and maybe like most of the other economies in Europe. So in that sense, I think the fact that they have that embarrassment of riches helps to explain some reasons why they don't have the same emphasis maybe as the rest of us. Okay, so moving on to let's say more formal issues in terms of how to interact with Norwegians. And so the first thing up, obviously, meeting and greeting. I would say here that it's pretty similar to everywhere else. Generally, people shake hands as equals. So you don't start with the boss and then move down to the lowest person in the other team. You shake hands as equals with everybody. Naming conventions, I would say at the start, it would certainly be formal, Mr., Mrs., Miss, whatever. And after that, in my experience, people use first names. Personal space is very, very different. So if you're talking with a Norwegian, they will actually stand back from you. So this is something, I guess, as an Irish person who then moved to Spain, my personal space probably started medium and went kind of close, and now it's going further out. So I would say that Norwegian is the personal space is bigger than in the other, maybe, as you move up through Europe. Needless to add, with the pandemic, handshaking disappeared. Now it is coming back. That's I think it's fair to say that it will totally come back. I had a Spanish colleague who came here, and you know, she had the custom of giving the 2 kisses to everybody she'd meet for the first time, and obviously that's something in Norway that would make your your interlocutors feel very uncomfortable if you dive in for the 2 kisses. So I would recommend not to do that. Topics and tips to avoid. Norwegians don't really engage in small talk, certainly in business settings. So, you know, the example I would give, if you came to a meeting and you were presenting to a group of people in Spain or in the UK or the US or Ireland or whatever, and let's say the group that you were meeting with, they didn't all come at the same time. So some people have arrived, we're waiting for some more people. And as an Irish person and a person who's lived in Europe, if there was no talk during those few minutes, I would feel extremely uncomfortable, and I would feel the need to fill that with small talk. A Norwegian would not. Okay, so that's not a problem. If you have, you know, if you find that everything is silent until you're ready to start, that's fine. There's really no issue with it, and you don't need to fill that space. In terms of their communication style, this is an important point. You know, I think in general, when you're dealing with Norwegians, and you're an English speaker, or you have to speak with them in English, the likelihood is that you will feel that Norwegians are all highly competent English speakers. And, you know, and they are, and there's a reason for that, is that Norwegian and English are close languages. That's the reality. And so it's relatively more easy for a Norwegian to be good at English than it is for a French person or an Italian or a Spanish person. That's just a fact, okay? So they do have good English. But you have to be aware that everything they're saying is still going through their filter in their mind between English and Norwegian. And everything you're hearing, unless you're a native English speaker, is going through your filter between his English, your English, and your Italian, Spanish, French, whatever. So there's a lot of different filters going on here. And the reason I mention this is that in that sense, when you're talking with Norwegians, you need to check that they understand what you're saying, because their English is so good, sometimes you assume they're understanding everything, but they may not be understanding it as you're understanding it or as I understand it, okay? Norwegians prefer a really plain, factual, direct speaking style. It's very straightforward, it's very honest, they'll say what they think, they don't try to dress up what they're talking about. And generally, they're very open about disagreements. So particularly maybe, you know, in written correspondence, they'll be very open about disagreements. But they're highly averse to conflict in a meeting situation. So we'll talk about meetings in a moment, and it's one of the real key frustrations that people who are dealing with Norwegians have in meeting settings, okay? But it's important about disagreements. And, you know, if you have a disagreement with them, you need to be very, very open about the disagreement. While certainly when you're writing about it, maybe in a meeting scenario, you have to be a little bit careful of how you deal with that. But, you know, in English language, when we talk about hedging strategies, like trying to blur maybe something so that it doesn't seem so harsh, that's not understood by Norwegians. They need you to say exactly what you think, and then they can discuss it openly, okay? This has implications, obviously, for the sales pitch. If you're giving a sales pitch, a product pitch to Norwegian buyers, it also should include a very open discussion on the weaknesses in your product or service. So one of the challenges anybody will have if you haven't done business here before is that you need to build confidence with the Norwegians, right? They don't like to be oversold to, so you have to be a little bit conservative about what you're, you know, how much you are embellishing your sales pitch, okay? Very importantly as well, Norwegians are, I think they refer to this as social speakers. So silence in the conversation is to be expected. So if you're explaining something to a group of people and you finish and there's a 10-second gap, In any other scenario, that means that you've just given a disastrous presentation and nobody's talking back to you. But with Norwegians, what it means is they're thinking about what you've said. And that 10-second gap is absolutely perfect. And also, when they're asking questions back to you, it's actually no harm that you leave there be a few second gap, because then you are signaling to your Norwegian team that you're taking the time to listen to what they said, and now you're going to give your response. And in any other part of Europe I've been to, I think that gap can only be about a second, and then it has to be filled in some way. Okay, so that's a really, really important difference, and something that takes, it's not something you'll get used to in one meeting. It actually takes quite a bit of being with Norwegians to get used to this style of paused presentation, and then a pause at the end, and then the next piece. It's a very, very paced conversation. Okay. One thing that the Irish have a habit of doing, and I'm guessing the Spanish as well, and probably most of the Europeans, is interrupting the other person before they finish talking. That is something that's completely, that will make a Norwegian really, really uncomfortable. So you have to be very, very careful about that. Also, body language. I think in the south of Europe, and certainly in Ireland, the places that I can vouch for, we tend to use quite a bit of body language. In Norway, they tend to be very muted and use very little body language. So do not take that as a sign of disinterest in what you're telling. It's just part of their culture. I should mention, if you're dealing with teams that are used to dealing with international suppliers, obviously they may not display all of these typical Norwegian characteristics, and they should be a little bit more open to any of your particular characteristics that come from each of us. Okay, gifts and food. This was one of the questions I think that arose the evening that we spoke. So this is interesting. In terms of gifts, and really the only time it's customary to bring a gift is when you're visiting a house in Norway. Okay, and it's not at all expected during a business meeting. So our recommendation is that you refrain from any sort of gifts in a business setting. Okay. Food culture. So the joke here amongst the foreigners is food culture. What food culture? If you're coming, I'm just imagining an Italian or a Spaniard or a French person, moving from their home country and setting up in Norway in a rail project and bringing their family with them. You will not be too impressed with the food culture in Norway. That's all I can say. Just in terms of the meals, you have frokost, which is breakfast. Lunch happens early, typically maybe even as early as 11 o'clock. Middag is generally the big meal of the day. That happens in the middle of the afternoon, typically around 4 o'clock, when most people will finish work. And then kvelds is a light, kind of more like a supper, we might call it in English, before bedtime. One thing that is noteworthy is coffee. The Norwegians are number 2 in the world in coffee consumption. And to my the Italians on the line, I would say that you could consider this to be an indication of quantity more than quality. Okay. But wherever you are in Norway, you will be offered coffee at any time of the day, in any setting, morning, midday, evening, after lunch, nighttime, indoors, outdoors. There is always coffee, always black, no sugar. So just beware of that. If any of you prefer decaf coffee, you will have a hard time finding it. That's all I would say. Okay, visiting a home. As I said, it's kind of unlikely as just a business partner that you would be invited to a Norwegian's house. But if you are invited, that is a really good sign that you're integrating well into Norwegian society. So a couple of things to note. As we mentioned earlier, a small gift is appropriate. So that could be something like a box of chocolates or a small plant or some flowers. That's perfectly acceptable. If you are invited to dinner in a house at 6 p.m., that means that the dinner will be served at 6 p.m. Okay, so you can arrive 5 minutes early or 1 minute early, but it means you will arrive and you will sit down and you will eat, and then maybe you will leave. And that was it. It was dinner, and you arrived and you ate and you left. So it won't be like arriving and then having an aperitif and then having dinner an hour later and then having, some afters. So that's very much it's a much more strictly defined event. In terms of the business meal, so you may be in situations, obviously we saw that lunch happens really, really early, but you may be in situations with partners where a business meal scenario may arise. And I would say from my experience and from asking people about this here, the most likely scenario is that everyone will offer to pay their own part. Okay, so that's a big difference to maybe what, the culture of hospitality in the rest of Europe. So the recommendation I would make is that even if you organize something, you should be specific in advance and say, listen, we're just going to split the bill. So you're never leaving even an ounce of doubt that some favor is being sought. Okay, so always make it very, very clear that either you want to pay your part, or that everyone will just pay their part and leave it at that. Okay, dress code. Again here, the Norwegians, I would say practicality is much more important than glamour or than elegance in the work setting. So where I am in Bergen, it rains a lot. So you will see people going into work and they will have their rain gear on. And I mean the serious rain gear. So the rainproof pants, the rainproof footwear, and a proper rain jacket and headgear. In cold weather, they will be dressed up in their thermals and their wools. And often when they get to work, they will change into indoor shoes. So it's not at all uncommon to arrive into a Norwegian workplace and you'll see people in their woolly jumpers and their old jeans and their sandals, and it's snowing outside. And the reason is that they're going to change when they go back outside. So that's obviously different. Now, needless to add, if you're in a work situation and you're going to give a presentation, then it's always safest to dress a little bit more conservatively. But I would say that elegance is not at all expected in the Norwegian workplace at all. The other thing, apparently, I'm told, that is a big no-no is strong cologne or perfume. All right, so in a different part of the world, that might be completely normal, but in Norway, it's really unusual, and apparently it's something that they don't like. And so as long as you're clean and your hair is clean, you can kind of be a little bit relaxed in the rest of the way that you dress. That's from Norwegians, because I've asked them extensively on this point. Obviously, in a meeting situation, for a guy, it's perfectly acceptable to wear a suit. For a woman, the same thing. I would say in terms of the business settings I've been at in Norway, it's most typical that the suit will be without a tie, and people will dress up in suit and tie for more ceremonial occasions only. Okay. Need to have a bit of water. Okay, meetings. So inevitably, if you're doing business in Norway, it's going to involve meetings. A number of things. In terms of the setup and punctuality, the best times for meeting Norwegians are, I would say, in the morning, 9 to 12. Bear in mind that there could be a lunch break at 11, or 1 to 3 in the afternoon, not after that, okay? The meeting should be set up beforehand, confirm it by telephone or email. Punctuality is really important for the Norwegians. So if you say, listen, we're going to meet at 3 o'clock, very important that you're there. They'll expect to start the meeting at 3 o'clock. Okay. The Norwegian meeting style, in many ways, it embodies some of the cultural traits that we've just discussed, and it reflects the characteristics of society, in terms of the flat hierarchy, particularly. So these are the key frustrations. So I researched this, with a number of people, shared my own experience and from different sectors. And these are the key frustrations that were listed with regard to the way that Norwegians behave in meetings. Okay, so there seems to be no clear boss. Everyone gets to speak their mind. There seems to be endless patience as this process of consultation takes place. It seems that it's more important that everyone gets heard than actually resolving an issue or reaching a decision. There may be no clearly defined agenda, and when there is one, they may not stick to it, or the meeting may not seem to progress in that fashion. It may just progress randomly. Often, no clear directions are given, and when a follow-up task is required, the tasks may be allocated based on participants volunteering, as opposed to the leader saying, okay, you do that, you do that, you do that, and decide who completes the tasks. There may be no contribution from the people who are expected to know the most. Problems may be identified and discussed, but no follow-up or resolution is reached. The meeting may end because participants have reached the end of their working day. In a different culture, they may say, okay, let's do another 15 minutes and get through to the end of the agenda. No, 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock, whatever it is, I've got to go, and that's it. Maybe nobody seems to take any responsibility. Negative feedback might not be well received. So there's no critical interaction in the sense that even if you're saying something and maybe they don't agree with you, but maybe they won't tell you. There seems to be no sense of urgency and no requirement for a decision or a resolution. Okay, so those are the principal frustrations of non-Norwegians with Norwegian meeting habits. One other thing that I should mention, and I think it's quite important, that while you or a cluster member may be communicating with somebody in English on a one-to-one basis and they feel that that person's English is fantastic, that person may not at all be comfortable standing up in a meeting and talking English with you in front of his colleagues because he may feel he's being judged by his colleagues. So I was told that that was something really that people aren't aware of because they think all Norwegians speak excellent English, but apparently amongst Norwegians there is a little bit of this reticence to speak English in front of other Norwegians because maybe you're being judged. Okay, so now we have some of the issues, and the next thing is, how do we reduce frustration and how do we deal with some of these issues? The first thing is to understand and accept. So that's, you know, part of the reason that we're all here today listening in, is just to get a feeling for, okay, maybe now we maybe understand why the Norwegians are doing this, because it's coming from the way that, you know, part of their national culture and their habits. We need to accept that Norwegians are somewhat unstructured and they may tend to avoid written documentation. Okay. Power distance is so low in Norway that all participants in the meeting, irrespective of knowledge or competence, may behave and may fully expect that their contribution is equally as relevant. And it will be accepted by everybody at the meeting that that is the case. Okay. We have to accept that the role of the leader in Norway is more to gather everyone's opinion, to be a coach, to be a facilitator, and to bring the group together in a sort of a momentum through consensus. That's more of their role than to act as a traditional business leader who organizes, controls, directs, and delegates. The paternalistic authoritarian figure is not at all the model that is common here. So first thing, well, first is understanding. Second thing, meeting agenda. Insist on a written meeting agenda beforehand. Okay, really important. It's a small thing, but it's going to help ensure that we avoid some of the issues that we find with Norwegian meetings. Okay, make sure that there is a dedicated secretary at the meetings, or volunteer one of your team to be one, to take the minutes, right? And so on the minutes, you got to include a clear list of decisions and action points. Okay. Assign responsibility. So also on the minutes of the meeting, you for every responsibility that is discussed during the meeting, and every follow-up point that is discussed, we need to identify who is responsible for each action item and make that very clear if we don't want this sort of kind of, you know, ad hoc voluntary system to take over. For those follow-up points, we need to set timelines for completion. And again, all of this goes in the report minutes and is circulated after the report. Very, very important. Solicit clear instructions regarding the task. So when you're dealing with Norwegians, it's very, very typical that they will say, okay, we need to do this. Okay, and you say, fine, okay, I'll do that. But there may be no instructions given to you on how do you actually go about doing that. So always solicit clear instructions when a Norwegian team is asking you to do something, okay? And elicit information on the resort. What are the resources? What is the outcome? What does success look like? Who are the key contact people I need to speak to in your organization to achieve this? What is the timeline? How do I resolve problems? Who in your organization do I go to if I have a problem? Okay, so make sure that that's all really, really clear in the minutes and circulated after the meeting. And then finally, in terms of feedback, if you have to critique Norwegians during a meeting, basically they tend to prefer let's say to have the criticism sandwiched between praise, let's say, like that, rather than just going straight for a criticism. And also, it's very important to try to get back from them if they have any issue with what you've spoken. So I spoke with one person in the construction sector last week, and he said this guy is he's American, and he's been based here for 10 years. And he said the amount of times I go to a team of Norwegians and I give a presentation and nobody says anything, and then the next day I get an email saying all the, you know, with a list of all the things that they disagree with. So you want to try and make sure that you're giving them the safe space to disagree with you, and to make sure before the meeting ends, you know, is there anything that we've said? Is there anything that we've done that you would prefer to be done in a different way? Is there anything that we've said here that's problematic? You know, please let us know now, so that we can, you know, we can take account of that and we can understand that, because they will be very, very reticent to get involved in any type of conflict face to face. So that's kind of, you know, best practice in terms of meetings. I think this is a fairly international thing. You know, I can see that this would make sense pretty much everywhere, but it's really important to have this discipline in Norway, because of the way that they may typically behave in a meeting scenario. Okay. Okay, so this one is kind of just to have a slight break in the run of slides. This is the Janteloven. So this is basically the kind of unwritten rules of Norwegian society, and it's a humorous attempt to distill Norwegian characteristics into a set of rules or laws which govern Norwegian behavior. So it's basically all about, you know, nobody's better than anybody else, right? And don't expect any special treatment because of who you are. Don't care if you're the boss of a big company, you've come to meet us, you know, doesn't matter. We're all the same, we're all equal. And that's it. So be aware of that, and don't take offense if in your interactions with Norwegians you feel that they're not maybe giving you the credit you deserve, or the, you know, the deference that you deserve. So I think there's an element of truth in all of this, maybe not as extreme as the Janteloven would have us believe. But one thing that you should be aware of is that, you know, of all of the places that I've lived and worked in, so I've, you know, been in Ireland, the UK, you know, working, the States, you know, and all of South of Europe, the Middle East, and North of Africa. I've never been in a country where people are pretty much universally happy with the way the country runs. You know, and I wouldn't say they're arrogant, but they're just extremely happy with the way Norway runs. So, you know, they have an assumption that the Norwegian model is superior to other economic models. And one of the topics on the table of contents, I think it was listed as topics best to avoid. So I think I mentioned in the country analysis that for me, one of the topics that's probably best to avoid if you don't want to wind up a Norwegian is, well, two actually. One, you can tell him that he doesn't know anything about stacking wood, and that's a good way to start a fun argument. The second would be that you say, well, Norwegians' economic wealth was all down to just a stroke of luck, and that this whole model of society that they have wouldn't be possible if they hadn't struck it rich with oil. Now, not strictly true, but it's one thing that they're not kind of conscious of that. They're very, very happy. The country runs well. They feel they've done the right things. They've been very wise at how they've used the oil revenue, that's for sure. And they just have an assumption that their model is better than other models. And specifically, one issue we didn't touch on in the country analysis, but I think it is important is, when you're coming from another country, you're always going to be aware that there may be country bias against you. So it has been suggested to me that if a Swedish company was procuring equipment and they had a choice to work between another Nordic country, for example, Swedish, sorry, did I say Swedish? I meant Norwegian. And if they were procuring equipment and they had a choice to work between another Nordic country like Sweden or a continental European country, they would pick Sweden if all other things were equal. And likewise, if they had to choose between maybe Germany and the Southern European countries, it was suggested to me that they would choose Germany. So that there are certain national characteristics that are maybe ingrained here, that they will first, probably easiest for them to deal with Scandinavians, and then gradually moving down through Europe. However, as we have seen, some of those tenders have been won by Spanish and Italian companies. So I don't want to overstate that, but it's always obviously worth having in the background that maybe as a Southern European country, you have to work a little bit harder in terms of selling your technical capabilities and your seriousness than another Northern European country would have to.
May I comment on that one, Brian?
Yes, of course, please.
I think there's because of this runs back a long way back in history. Before we had the European Union and all the different agreement to buy and sell to each other, the Norwegian or Nordic countries really were dependent on each other, because we are small countries and we have a lot of resources locally, but we are not self sufficient. So we were really dependent on doing business together to be able to survive up in the cold climate here in the north. So I guess things are changing, but the old tradition Nordic way of doing business has been quite in our genes, to say. It's in the backbone. But also the thing that you have on the screen now, janteloven in Norwegian, we have the same way of saying in Swedish, we call it jantelagen. Okay. And this is really, really things that you can sometimes touch, and especially if you move outside the big cities. If you go just about 15 or 150 kilometers from Stockholm area. Stockholm is a big traditional international city now. But if you go to Västerås or a few kilometers away off, this jantelagen or janteloven is really, really into the mind of the employees, the mind of the business culture in that area. So basically, don't come here and expect that you will be or think that you are something bigger than us, so to say. It is really important. And I have seen local companies trying to do business with municipalities just an hour traveling from their office, and has lost the business because, okay, you think you're from a bigger city than, and you're trying to come here and tell us how to run things. That is not accepted. So I maybe you have a similar stuff in your own countries, but if I, as a Nordic person, would give you some heads up, this slide is really important, because you can't read this in any publication. This is the topic where you need to really step back and feel the context that you are in for the moment.
Thank you for that. And it's interesting because I think maybe in other countries, certainly in Ireland, and I think to an extent in Spain as well, and they can correct me on this, but if a foreign company comes to offer you something, there's almost and maybe an assumption that it is better than something you have in your home country. So it's the opposite of this, rather than a kind of a rejection of it. So, but yeah, I agree. I mean, those are really, really interesting points. And I mean, we've seen it personally. My wife works in the university, and she's Spanish, and she works in the English department. And, she's had comments from different people within the university hierarchy, kind of expressing surprise that a Spaniard could be in the English department, of the University of Bergen. So just again, probably linking back to this, and not said in a bad way, but just kind of, marking a certain amount of distance, and you don't want to show up and say, well, we're the superstars and our product is the best thing since sliced pan, and, we're selling all around the world. It's got to be approached in a very kind of tactical and subtle way, I suspect. Okay. Okay, negotiation. So at some point or another, if you're doing business in Norway, obviously you're going to end up in a negotiation situation. The first point I would make is that it's important to ensure that you're interacting at the right level. And by what I mean here is that in Norway, it actually can be quite easy to reach top-level executives within a corporation. It doesn't seem to be hard to reach them. However, because of the way that business works in Norway, the person, the lady at the top, may not be the person that you should be talking to. And so, she may not be closely involved in her team's work. And you may need to be very, very specific about who you would like to meet with in order to avoid wasting time and energy. Whereas in other countries, it always seems to be best to go as high as you can go. And that, that will be the person who will make things happen. It may not be the case here, okay? Language, again, I mentioned about English, and this is just to reiterate it here, that make sure that they understand what you're saying. It's not, their English, their spoken English is great. Their written English isn't always as good. And it's important to always grasp what you've said, particularly in a complex kind of negotiation situation. It's important that they understand exactly, the general idea, but they may not have caught all of the finer details in your discussion, okay? And make sure to check through any documents that they've exchanged with you in English, and clarify any ambiguities at an early stage. And remember what I said about that they may be a little bit less free in talking English when they're in front of all of their colleagues, because they may feel like they're being judged. And in terms of the presentation and negotiation style, in terms of, we already spoke about when you're presenting, when you're meeting with people, very, very important to have a clear agenda, and very fact-oriented presentation form. Also important that you stick to a time frame. If you have a meeting set up and it lasts for half an hour, try to stick to that half an hour. Norwegians can be very, very, they can be empowered, so they can be very quick to make decisions and inclined to take quick decisions. So negotiations can move much faster than in other countries. total honesty and openness are expected. So from the start, if you can be really, really open about any weaknesses in your offering, and then I think it would be positive to do so, because then you're going to help build trust and you're proving to them that you're not trying to hide anything in your offer. Okay. In terms of contracts and agreements, in Norway, contracts and agreements, they're mutually binding. Prices, specifications are black and white, and an offer stands as tendered. So once you've made an offer, you really have to stick with it. Any bargaining and haggling, it's really not in the culture to do that, and probably would not be well received and may kind of generate resistance or doubts amongst your Norwegian interlocutors. Now, this can be quite refreshing, because obviously it means that you can be very, very open right from the start about what you can and can't do. You can present the price that you think is fair, and if they like it, they'll accept it. They don't tend to get involved in beating around the bush. Once an agreement has been accepted, then all parties are expected to honor all agreements and promises. Okay, we spoke a little bit about a bias, maybe an unconscious bias against the southern countries. So you need to be a little bit aware of that you might have to work harder to establish your seriousness and your bona fides and the reference points that you have from other work that you've done. One of the things that maybe will play in favor of the foreign countries tendering for business is there is an appetite for risk. So if you can establish your credentials, Norwegians will be willing to take a risk. Because remember, the culture of blame is completely different here. So the ability, trial and error is expected, and they will be willing to take risks that other procurers in other countries would not. So you may not need a long-standing relationship in order to conduct business. I think that's important. So key things, it's very, very important to establish and give an appearance of trustworthiness. We mentioned about the bargaining and haggling. Trustworthiness and reliability in all aspects. This is a really huge importance here. So everything about the way you conduct the meeting and negotiation should be designed to reinforce that you're a serious company, you're formal, you're reliable, there's no messing, what you see is what you get. And that'll put you in the best possible position to be considered. Then in terms of management style, if you're involved in projects jointly with Norwegian companies, and I'm conscious that there may be many different forms of working with Norway. It might not be just one of your clusters, one of your SMEs setting up a company. You might be involved in a project or part of a Norwegian company that's bidding. So it's important to bear in mind a few things about the management style here. So we mentioned before, really, really flat hierarchy. So management in the Norwegian workplace is based on the concept of trust-based leadership. Okay, employees, they have a great deal of freedom, and there's often very, very little follow-up or feedback or instruction. And this can be a major difficulty for non-Norwegians. So there's a total assumption of responsibility, honesty, initiative. You're expected to get on with the job, but you might not be told how to get on with the job or how you actually should go about it. The leader of the team generally expects the team members to act with responsibility, honesty. He expects them to get involved, to show initiative, and to act with independence and autonomy. There is very much an aversion to authority. You'll never see a leader barking out orders to people. Just doesn't happen. I mean, even on, near where I live here on the walk to school, we pass a building site every day. I have never heard such a quiet building site in my life. There's no foreman barking out instructions. There's nothing. Everybody just goes about their work. And I guess they maybe get some instructions in the morning, or they just know what they have to do and they just get on with it. Tasks are often not given are often not explained. There may be no direct or detailed instructions. decisions, you're expected to arrive at decisions based on consensus, and or at least the semblance of consensus. So, you know, foreigners can end up really exasperated with the time it takes to actually reach decisions with Norwegians, you know. And one of this point that was made to me, and maybe Petra, you can comment on this, but there was the analogy was given that Norwegian consensus meant that everybody at the table got to speak, and then no decision was made. Whereas Swedish consensus was described to me as everybody at the table got to speak, but then the boss decided what to do. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, if you feel that's fair.
Sorry, I was just laughing outside the mic. This is really one good comment, and I saw in one really early slide that don't make fun of our country for the Norwegians. Swedes and Norwegians has always made comments about each other's countries and the way we are behaving, but there could be some truth behind this point, because Swedes, I guess, have also this flat organizations, and everyone is assumed to drive their own topics and tasks, but there is a slightly more strongly leadership. So the boss wants to make sure that he or she is the boss, and sometimes they need to show that they are the boss in Sweden. So that could be some way of putting it that way. But I think the Norwegians and Swedes are really the same in the from the beginning, so to say. But Swedish are getting a little bit more hierarchic in their organization structures. It is very important that you have this organization chart that shows who is the manager of which team and who are really in charge if something happens or you need to make some kind of decision. But the consensus part is still very important in Sweden as well.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks very much for that. Okay, so I think we might have one more. Yeah, teamwork. Teamwork obviously is very important. We saw the concept of the dugnad, and you know, the idea that working in the team, it's often perceived that the team pulling together and moving in the same direction is of more importance than having individual stars. And you know, over time, that's probably a wise decision. The leader is considered just one more employee. And this is the concept of, I think we touched on it earlier, about compressed wages, that the difference between what the boss earns and what the boss of the company earns and what the person on the lowest wage in the company earns is probably much, much less than it would be in most other Western economies. And you know, there was a funny story that was related to me, and I think it goes back to a couple of years back, where the prime minister of the country at the time instructed the manager of the oil fund to do a certain thing, whatever it was, change a certain way that they were investing, or whatever the instruction was. And the leader of the oil fund basically was asked for a comment and said that they would take the prime minister's comments as a useful contribution to their next meeting, meaning that it was just another contribution and it was going to be treated the exact same way as the contribution of the least experienced person sitting at the table. So That's their management style. Okay, next one up, and this is, I mean, this is kind of funny, but it's really, really practical as well, because obviously most of your communication with Norwegians is going to be by email. And so typically they will start with hey, which is basically hello, and not dear. So in Norwegian, when you say dear, that's something you would say to your partner. You know, it's not something you would say to somebody that you have a business relationship with. Okay, and they sign off with MVH, which is just best regards. So that's what you'll see if you're receiving emails from Norwegians and they start with just hey, then you know it's not offensive and it's not them being too casual to you. They may just not want to call you dear, and that's because they just don't use that in Norway. The other thing, they're a little bit notorious in terms of not responding to emails. So the whole issue of, you know, politeness or lack of politeness, there's a whole linguistic study on politeness, and one field is on email politeness, electronic communication politeness. So in Norway, they do not have those sensibilities. So if I send an email to Norwegian and I say, oh, I'm just sending you the information that you promised me last week, and I send it, and then I get nothing back. And then maybe a week later, I'm talking with the person. I said, did you get that? And they'll say, yeah, I did. Yeah, thanks very much. But you didn't acknowledge it. There is maybe no feeling that they need to acknowledge it. They asked for it, you sent it, end of story. So that's something you need to expect, and not see it as necessarily a problem, but it is important in all sorts of aspects of Norwegian life to pick up the phone and ring them and just check, because there are so many things where you won't get the response. You will need to check, and you need to do it by phone, and it's a better way to establish a rapport with somebody anyway. Okay, moving on to the next section. So this was basically from your table of contents, where there were a number of dimensions of national culture, and this comes from Geert Hofstede's model of national culture. So this gentleman became famous for his framework for cross-cultural communication. So he basically attempted to show the effect of a society's culture on the values of its members, and how these values related to behavior using a structure derived from factor analysis. So he was working with IBM, I believe. So they had employees all over the world, and it was very important for them to understand these cultural differences. So there were 6 elements. They're all dealt with in the country analysis. Here we're just going to deal with the top 3, because the other 3 actually, you know, these dimensions are based on a score of 0 to 100. Okay, so it's only noteworthy if there isn't if there's a score one way or the other. So the second 3 didn't have a notable obvious difference one way or another. So Norway was considered neutral in those terms. So the first one we're going to look at is masculinity and femininity. So interestingly here, Norway had a score of 8 out of 100. So this is exceptionally low, which means that it's considered a very feminine state. In fact, the second most feminine state on the whole score, on the whole ranking, after Sweden. Okay. And the implications of this are that let's say the softer aspects of culture are valued and encouraged, such as being honest with others, working for consensus, cooperation, sympathy for the underdog, taking care of the environment is important in feminine societies. Trying to be better than others is neither socially nor materially rewarded. And societal solidarity in life is important. You work to live and you do your best. So incentives such as free time and flexibility are favored more than maybe monetary incentives. Okay. Interaction through dialogue and growing insight between people is considered very, very important. And self-development is encouraged. Focus is on well-being, and status is not necessarily to be shown. So here we're back to the idea of the surgeon who gets very wealthy, but stays in the same house living beside the bus driver, okay? So in this sense, an effective manager is one who is a very supportive manager. Decision-making is best achieved through involvement, okay? In terms of gender equality and equality in general in the workplace, in Norway, there's a really high degree of equality in the workplace and in society. I would say there's very little stigma for women in terms of the choice of job. Just a personal example, I had never seen a woman drive a crane before, and I saw that you know, on the actually on the light rail project in Fillingsdown down the road here. So there's a high degree of gender neutrality at work, and also there's, you know, talking to women here, there's very little stigma attached to marital status, whereas it may be an issue in some other countries. Really, it's not an issue here at all. Unmarried, divorced, single parents, it makes absolutely no difference to a Norwegian. They're completely impervious to that. And also interesting, so little social stigma, we mentioned that. Also noteworthy that it was commented to me that men are less attentive in terms of, let's say, if you were to hold the door for a female colleague as a man, or you were to say, offer to help a female colleague in some physical task. I had the experience of holding the door for people just because I was just used to holding the door for the next person coming through the door. And a Norwegian mentioned to me that, no, you don't hold the door for a woman in Norway. It just so happened to be a woman who was following me. And the idea is that if a woman wants help, she'll ask for it, right? So that's it. You don't have to offer to lift a bag or help her lift the table. If she's able to lift the table, she'll lift it herself. And if she wants help, she'll ask you. So there, you know, there's bound to be some, you know, some cultural, let's say, curious cultural faux pas that anybody who moves to Norway will find themselves committing. But it's interesting to note about the society being considered the second most feminine after Sweden. Power distance. We've alluded to this, not in this name, but on a number of different elements so far. So this relates to the extent to which less powerful members of institutions or organizations or society within a country expect and accept that power is distributed unequally. So Norway scores low in this dimension. And that means that the following characteristics are noteworthy. Independence, everybody's voice is heard. So here we have the issue at the table. Everybody's talking about the issue, whether they're expert on it or not, okay? Hierarchy, that's just for convenience. It's generally very flat. Equal rights, superiors are accessible, and management are equals. The leader is there as an approachable coach, there to help out, to kind of give some guidance, and then to step out of the way, okay? The management is there to facilitate, to empower, but there's no need to impress the boss, and there's no detailed instructions have to be given. People will just get on with it. Power is very decentralized, and managers will rely on the experience of the team members. The employees expect to be consulted on everything. They'll never find that the manager walks in one day and says, hey, we're going to open an office in, you know, Stavanger. No, that would have to be discussed way before with the whole team. The manager can't just come in and decide that. Employees expect to be consulted. Control is disliked, and the attitude in general towards managers is very informal and would be first name basis. So communication would be direct, participative, and consensus oriented. Okay. So, you know, this obviously has relatively low levels of inequality. I think we dealt with that already about, you know, the bus driver, the surgeon, they stay as neighbors. So this has major implications for management style and for chairing of meetings. So the Norwegians that you will be dealing with will all consider you an equal, whether you're in charge of them, whether you're there to direct them or not, but they will consider you an equal. It's a very egalitarian society. It's very, very classless, even though they do have a king, but the king is almost regarded as just another citizen as well. And you know, we mentioned before, there are relatively small salary differences between higher and lower professions. Okay. Individualism versus collectivism. So this dimension has to do with whether people's self-image is defined in terms of I or we. So in individualist societies, people are supposed to look after themselves and their direct family only. So Norway has a high score, well, medium high score on this, and is considered an individualistic society. Okay, so that's kind of hard to get your head around, because I kind of very much thought of Norway as a group society, but the way it actually works in this dimension is that the self is considered important and individual personal opinions are valued and expressed. So again, we have the idea that everybody at the table gets to talk. Communication is explicit, right? At the same time, the right to privacy is important and respected. You know, generally, you wouldn't be kind of having small talk with Norwegians about their family. They won't engage in it, and they won't expect it. You know, if they're finished work at 3 o'clock, they're leaving at 3 o'clock on the dot. Makes no difference. It doesn't matter what they're doing. Halfway through an email, they'll finish and they're going home, because their privacy is very important. And there are really clear lines between, sorry, I wasn't moving forward here, really clear lines between work and private life. And that's really, really something you will notice here. There is a lot of free time, and people will want to spend that free time with their families. Job mobility is higher, and one thinks in terms of individual careers. The employer and the employee relationship, it's contractual. It's not considered emotional in any way. You're not, you know, you haven't sold your soul to the company. It's a contract. And leaders focus on the management of individuals. Feedback is very much direct. You won't likely encounter any nepotism here at all. Okay. All right, so I think we're coming towards the end now. The last slide was just on some business travel issues. I think the first question here was on visa requirements. So this is something I do have to do some follow-up here for Veronica regarding, you know, in terms of staying in Norway for just a shorter period of time. So I need to check that out. And for people within the Schengen area, obviously they can come here. For people outside of the Schengen area, it's a 90-day limit. They'll have to get a visa. But I need to check out for Veronica about, you know, if they were staying for 6 months, would they have to get the Norwegian ID number? So I'll get back to you on that. Main airports and airlines, SAS, Norwegian, KLM, and Widerøe are the main Norwegian airlines. And the key airports would obviously be Gardermoen is the main international airport in Oslo, beautiful new airport, and Bergen airport over where I am, again, a beautiful airport on the west coast. You know, you may have to, there aren't that many direct flights. Obviously, the flight schedules are coming back now after COVID, but there has been a kind of a lack of direct flights to major European capitals. So expect you may need to have a layover. Bergen airports, you can get to the city center on light rail, and Oslo airport, you can also get to Oslo city center on the Flytoget, which we saw earlier on. The top hotel chains, the main ones are Nordic Choice, Scandic, Pon Hotels, and Radisson Blu. And again, all of these are listed in detail in the country analysis. Travel insurance, obviously you should come with travel insurance anytime you travel to any country for business. COVID, all of the COVID restrictions have been lifted. So you're free to travel here. You will need your COVID passport, obviously, but any of the restrictions, mask wearing, that's all been lifted, okay? Clothing, when traveling to Norway, dress for the weather. They all do. It's perfectly acceptable to turn up at meetings in your rain gear and fully understood. I would suggest that for all of your knowledge, Norwegians in the wintertime, they wear wool thermal underwear, top and bottom, and then you're good till about -10 degrees. Rain gear, very important. Proper rain footwear, very, very important, okay? hats, gloves, needless to say. Particularly, I'm imagining if you were out looking at, you know, railway projects, you could really be out in the back of beyonds, and it's amazing how cold, even if you've got all the gear on, you know, it's amazing how cold you can even get through your feet when there's severe weather conditions. So you have to be careful. Internal travel, just something to note on this, you know, the distances, obviously we saw that Norway is a very, very long country, right? And so the distances covered can be vast, but also do bear in mind that in Norway, for example, last summer we stayed in Norway for our vacation, and we were going to drive to a town called Ålesund, which is about 300 kilometers from here. So if I was in Spain, I could drive from Cáceres to Madrid in 3 hours, and that would be 320 kilometers. And in Norway, when I was talking to people planning the trip, they were saying, okay, so they were talking about the trip in terms of, you know, how many hours it would take rather than how many kilometers it was, because the kilometers were irrelevant. You may have fjord crossings, so you have to stop for the ferry, and you may have slow traffic. The road system is really, really poor compared to the rest of Europe. And there were very few motorway stretches, very few dual carriageway stretches. So most of the road was two-way road. So if you're stuck behind a number of trucks, tough, and the speed limits are very, very low. So you just have to take your time. So when you're traveling within Norway, if you're traveling for business, I would highly recommend you're either flying or you're taking the train. And best not to rent a car and drive around. It can be quite uncomfortable, and the times can be much longer than you would expect. In the wintertime, you've got issues with the potential for roads to be closed due to snow, etc. So just something to bear in mind when you're traveling. And finally, the emergency numbers, I think, are listed in the country analysis.